Good morning, afternoon, and hello. I'd like to welcome everybody to this month's webinar, Strategies for Nonprofit Executive Succession Planning. My name is Max Smith. I'm the Communications Director for 501c Services. As many of you know, we're a 100% employee-owned company that provides alternatives to state-run unemployment insurance programs. We have about 1,500 customers nationally. Many of you on today's call are already working with us. We administer a couple of programs. The 501c Agencies Trust is our largest program. We also work with the Boy Scouts of America, and we operate a private program called UInsure, which is an insurance option for unemployment compensation, unemployment reimbursing. So we have several options for unemployment insurance programs for 501c3s, and hopefully if you have any questions about such things, you know who I am and where you can get hold of me. A little bit of housekeeping before I hand today's session off to Nathan. We will be taking questions during the session, kind of. We have a couple of stopping points where Nathan's going to take a breath and answer a couple of questions, and then we will round up everything at the end with any additional questions. So as usual, if you got a question, go ahead and shoot it to me. We'll kind of curate them on our end and try to have as many answers as possible. Plus, you can always contact me or Nathan directly to get anything answered. Today's materials are already available in the handout section of your GoToWebinar browser under handouts, so the slide deck is there. It's a lot of slides. He's going to go through a lot of stuff, so it might be helpful to follow along. That slide deck will also be emailed to you later today, as will a recording of the whole program. So if you want to share whatever you hear, either just a deck or a video recording, it's all going to be available. Recertification credits, you know the drill on those. There's going to be a survey that's going to pop up when the program closes. You need to answer that survey, tell me what kind of certification credit you want, and I will shoot that back to you. The survey will also be available in the follow-up email that goes out later today. So if you have to jet for a meeting or for lunch or whatever, you can answer that survey later in the day. Future webcasts. Next month, we are doing our annual mid-year nonprofit accounting update with our friends at Marks Paneth. So if you have a CFO, if you have an accounting department, please share that with them. Tuesday, August 13th. That's one of our most well-attended sessions. We kind of catch everybody up about middle of the year about what's going on with the nonprofit finances and any rules changes. Okay, so I'm done. I'm going to hand this off to Dr. Nathan Schaumleffel. I think I get that right. Nathan is the senior consultant for Driven Strategic. They're a nonprofit consulting firm. They specialize in fundraising, strategic planning, board development, governance, youth development, mission-focused programming, and evaluation, such as he's going to talk about today with succession planning. So Nathan also has partnered with us and the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance to create an online course we have called Effective Staff Supervision for Nonprofit Organizations. Nathan, I'm going to go ahead and hand you control. How are you doing this morning?
Doing great. Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here today. Thank you.
All righty, let me see. You should have the pop-up window now.
All right. Okay, well, thank you, Mac, and I appreciate everybody that's logged in today. I hope you can stay the whole time. If you can, I certainly understand, and just know that everything's going to be available as handouts and also recorded. And it will also be on our YouTube channel, our website, and also 501c Services. The other thing I wanted to mention is this presentation is actually being released as a 3-part article on the 501c e-newsletter. Part 1 was published about a month ago, about 3 weeks ago. Part 2 will be coming out next week, and Part 3 in mid-August. So if you're looking for a written document that follows the content in an article, that's available too. So as Max said, my name is Dr. Nathan Schaumleffel. I'm proprietor and senior consultant of Driven Strategic LLC, a consulting firm out of Terre Haute, Indiana. It's on the Illinois-Indiana border, about 1 hour due west of Indianapolis. And we're here to talk about strategies for nonprofit executive succession planning today. I do talk fast, and do have quite a bit of content for an hour, so we will pause at 2 points. Please send in your questions, and I'm available until about 3:30 today. So if there are questions that last that long, I'll be glad to take those questions if you want to hang on and have a conversation at the end of the presentation at 1 o'clock. If you can't hang around after 1, you can simply go to my website at drivenstrategic.com, scroll all the way down to the bottom right side of my homepage. You'll find a time trade logo, and you can just jump on my schedule and make an appointment with me, and we can Skype or Google Hangout or do a conference call or however you'd like to communicate, and I'd be glad to chat over the next 3 or 4 weeks, whatever is best for you. So without further ado, at Driven Strategic, we're driven to kind of 3 underlying themes: strategic living, strategic nonprofit leadership, and strategic service engagement. With that, today we're going to focus primarily on strategic nonprofit leadership, and at the end we'll talk a bit about strategic living. With that, just to get a little bit more acquainted with me without going into great detail, I do spend a lot of time doing all the consulting work for the National Association of Park Foundations, also a consulting partner for the Indiana Youth Institute, and also direct the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance certification program at Indiana State University, where I serve as a faculty member there. In that role, I spend quite a bit of time with the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance with their Leaderosity program, which is their online training tool that 501c Services is partnered with, and then also spend a lot of time in the area of community engagement and service learning, working with nonprofits through the university, and have published a book there. So if any of that's an interest to you, feel free to jump on drivenstrategic.com. We do have a Leaderosity course launching July 22nd on effective staff supervision in nonprofit organizations. It's not too late to register, and hope that you or others in your organizations might consider registering for that course. At Driven Strategic, we work with lots of different types of nonprofit and public organizations, from arts all the way down to tourism and agritourism and festival organizations. And when people ask me, how do you work with such a disparate kind of eclectic group of types of organizations, I tell them very simply that all nonprofits are pretty well like cheeseburgers. They have the same ingredients, it's just that their output is different. So when I look at nonprofits and look at nonprofit consulting and nonprofit coaching, I really look at this top bun as the governance and C-suite leadership. And I look at the bottom bun as technology, cultural competence and diversity and equity, and legal and ethical decision making. And really that governance and C-suite leadership, that top bun is like the umbrella that oversees the entire organization and all its functions. I know you guys are looking hungry at that cheeseburger at a noontime webinar here. And the bottom, it's not that it's the least important, but that it's infused into all the other ingredients, things like cultural competence and diversity and technology and ethics. In the middle are the ingredients of mission awareness, which is what I call communications, marketing, and public relations. Relationship building and resource development, what many of you might call fundraising. I look at that more broadly to be equipment, supplies, building and land, and also volunteer resources. Program services, events, training, products, and advocacy efforts kind of bundled together. And then lastly, financial management and audit. And so with that today, we're talking about strategies for nonprofit succession planning, particularly for the CEO and the senior staff. And so when I talk about senior staff and the CEO, I'm talking about the C-suite. The C-suite would be the chief executive officer, the chief human resources officer, chief information officer, chief strategy officer, etc. And so we'll put a focus on the human resources ingredient of our cheeseburger here, particularly related to the CEO and the rest of the C-suite. Here's what we know. 501c Services, just about a month and a half, 2 months ago, published a newsletter where they had this intriguing article about the CEO turnover is up 22% already in 2019. So we're barely halfway through 2019, and we're already up 22% over 2018 for the number of nonprofit CEOs that are departing their positions. What we do know, without getting into a ton of slides and statistics, is very simply that CEOs and senior staff for the C-suite of nonprofits are disproportionately and nearly alarmingly leaving their positions for a variety of reasons. And so if we're going to be consistent and going to be impactful with our missions, we have to find a way to keep and retain our CEO and C-suite leadership. And if they do depart, we have to have a succession plan in place where we don't have to rebuild our staff, but simply reload. So with that, human resources and CEO and senior staff succession planning is ultimately about mission and vision. And think of me as a lover or a naive professional or whatever it might be, but the prism I look through is mission and vision. And anytime an organization says, what should we do? I refer them and say, well, what should you do based on your mission and vision? And so with that, everything that I'm going to talk about today comes back to being mission and vision focused. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to lay out multiple slides, and they're going to have very short phrases on them. And at the end, I'll put them all together on one slide, but it's going to take you some time to chew on it. What I find after nearly 30 years in this profession of nonprofit leadership and management, from being a volunteer, a researcher, a professional, an executive director, a founder, an educator, a board member, is really everything comes down to culture. Culture trumps strategy. And as you go through these next several slides, just think about them and at least give me a chance to help you digest through them. But this is what matters. And when we talk about culture trumping strategy and that strategy drives structure, anytime we diagnose an organization's problem and peel things back, they peel back in this order. And we have to address these issues in this order if we're going to help an organization effectively and impactfully work towards their mission. So here goes. Culture trumps strategy. Strategy drives structure. Structure requires resources. And resources accomplish objectives, produce outputs, and achieve outcomes. And it's outcomes that effectuate the mission, and the mission begets vision. So I know that's a mouthful. Let's take a look at it together here. Culture trumps strategy. Strategy drives structure. Structure requires resources. Resources accomplish objectives, produce outputs, and achieve outcomes. Outcomes effectuate mission, and mission begets vision. And so as a nonprofit consulting, as I mentioned, as I try to accurately diagnose that, rarely to never does it make sense to invest in programmatic or service changes to fix a strategy issue, nor does it really make sense to implement a structure solution when you have a culture issue. So it's important to diagnose nonprofit problems correctly and then take the appropriate action or solution to solve the problem. So with that, let's think about structure. Structure requires resources, and nonprofits have four kinds of resources. We have physical resources, financial resources, organizational resources, and human resources. And really, it's the human resources that we need to think about for this particular presentation, because it's the human resources that accomplish the objectives in an organization, produce the outputs, and achieve the outcomes. Culture always trumps strategy. And culture is a human resource issue, and culture is a human resource issue at all levels of nonprofit organizations, including the CEO and senior staff level. So many people don't understand when I talk about organizational culture, but organizational culture ultimately is the way things get done on a day-to-day basis, and it's the unwritten rules that people live by and how they behave within an organization. So culture, the way we do things around here, and the unwritten rules. Culture can be healthy, organizational culture can be toxic, but what I find in my experience is that the things that really matter with organizational culture, day-to-day behavior between volunteers and staff, is fairness and transparency and accountability and respect and civility and collegiality. But what I find most is many organizations have a number of people who have a fairly low emotional intelligence, which leads to a lot of conflict problems and leads to a lot of civility problems and a lot of collegiality problems. And if we, through human resources, can not only recruit people with higher emotional intelligence and to coach people to improve their emotional intelligence, we can better resolve conflicts in a way that are civil and collegial so that we have a better culture. What we know from research is that culture is learned and culture can be toxic. And remember, whether it's a healthy culture or a toxic culture, culture is a human resource issue, and toxic culture is a staff turnover issue. and that toxic culture is an unemployment expense issue, which for many of you is the reason that you're a member of 501c services, is to find ways to keep your unemployment expenses down. So if we're going to keep our unemployment expenses down, we have to deal with toxic culture so that we can better retain staff. So here's where it really summarizes to this point, is that attracting and retaining top talent is one of the greatest culture challenges that exist in nonprofit organizations. Culture is a CEO and senior staff succession planning issue, and culture is ultimately a mission and vision issue. So with that, I'm going to give Mac a chance to pose a few questions before I ask you what the $1 million question is. Mac, are there any questions yet?
I was on mute. Sorry about that.
That's
no,
okay.
We do not have any questions yet this morning.
No questions yet. Okay. I'll just give anybody that has a question just a chance to type those into Mac, and I will pause for just a moment for him to take a peek at those. No takers?
I think we're good.
All right. So what you're going to hear me come back to throughout this presentation is three things. It is simply organizational culture, employee retention, and succession planning. And to recognize that if you're thinking about writing a succession plan for a nonprofit organization, you can't talk about succession planning without talking about employee retention. You can't talk about employee retention without talking about organizational culture. We want to make sure that you peel that onion back in the appropriate order and address them within your nonprofit organization. So rhetorically, the $1 million question here then is, why are nonprofit organizations experience an increase in CEOs and senior staff departing their organizations? And there are a number of reasons, but at the top of that chart, at the top of the list is toxic organizational culture, and also lack of upward mobility within the nonprofit where the individual's working. Other reasons include ineffective performance, unbalanced work-life relationships, physical and emotional health issues, a high level of burnout, new family responsibilities like caregiving for older adults and parents, caregiving for children with special needs or a new infant in the home, new employment opportunities, retirement, and even sudden death. So lots of reasons that the C-suite leaves. But we got to recognize leading that list is toxic organizational culture and also the lack of upward mobility within an organization. So that leaves us to the $1 billion question, which is, why should nonprofit organizations of all sizes embrace succession planning? And the short answer to that is there's some advantages for employees, and there's also some advantages for employers. So I'm not going to read every point on these slides. I know you can read those as I'm chatting with you, but I'm going to hit some highlights here. First and foremost, for employees, knowing that the organization's helping that person build a career and to build security and sustainability within the organization not only increases self-esteem, but also self-respect, knowing that their employer is investing in them. It reinforces the desire for career development and career opportunities. It provides a structure to a career plan that attains the correct experiences education for career progression. So lots of reasons to have a succession planning process within your nonprofit for your employees. For your employers, it allows you to adapt to demographic changes, to retain institutional knowledge, since we live in a knowledge economy. It boosts morale, and it replaces unique or highly specialized competencies. Furthermore, for the employees, it ultimately activates your strategic plan. You have to have C-suite level leaders that stay at your organization so that we can activate your strategic plans to get you to your mission and vision in a way that's sustainable. Now, the interesting thing here is succession planning, I hope you're convinced, is really important. That succession planning, we back up to employee retention, we back up to organizational culture, but kind of like wills for the average middle class American, or for any American for that reason, to have a last will and testament, nonprofits don't have succession plans. Board Source reports that only 27% of nonprofit organizations have a written succession plan. And quite frankly, I think that's very high. The nonprofits that interface with Board Source and participate in their research are larger nonprofits that are more well organized, that have more professional staff and more resources. right now there are almost 2 million nonprofits in the United States. That has almost doubled since the year 2000. We had about 1 million in 2000, and in 19 years, we're sitting at about 1.85, 1.9 million nonprofits, and about 50% of those have gross receipts, gross revenues of less than $100,000 a year. So if nonprofits are bringing in that little revenue, they probably only have 1 or 2 staff members, maybe one full-time on salary, maybe others part-time hourly. But I would say that it's more like, from my experience in consulting work, probably 5% or less of our nonprofits have a written succession plan in place. And that's the nonprofit sector. Equally as bad in the for-profit sector, the Harvard Business Review reports that almost half of companies with revenue greater than 500 million have no meaningful succession plan. So we're not doing a great job of it in the independent sector, the third sector, the social sector, whatever you want to call the nonprofit world, but the for-profit sector is doing a poor job too. What we do know is that 10 to 15% of nonprofits hire a new executive director every year, which is pretty scary. And 60 to 75% of our executive directors plan to leave their positions within the next 5 years. So the question becomes is what strategic nonprofit leadership strategies should nonprofit organizations use for C-suite succession planning? And so what I want to get into are some very specific in the weeds strategies that you can use at your organization, or use some or one of them or all of them. So I think this would be a good point, Mac. Again, if there are any questions, this would be a good place for me to pause and to take some questions.
So do you have some numbers? Rebecca wants to know what you would consider a typical, she's got that in quotes, nonprofit CEO to be, like, demographically.
I don't have that off the top of my head, so I don't want to speculate, but I'd be glad to follow up one-on-one after the session to talk about that, or to schedule an appointment with Rebecca.
Okay. And then Mike is interested to know, when it comes to culture, which is more important, the board, the CEO, or the senior staff? I'm assuming it's a mix, but can you go into what's more important on those three?
Absolutely. One of my first strategies will be to talk about that here in the next few slides, but I will say it's a mix. It's both, but it starts with the board, and culture always starts with the board, and I'll give some reasons for that. So yes, it's a mix, but it starts with the board of directors. So let's jump into some strategic nonprofit leadership using succession planning. And I want to make sure we're on the same page, because succession planning means different things to different people. I didn't make up these definitions. Susan Heathfield and some others have published heavily on this, and their stuff's really good. So I'm going to cite them and just say that I subscribe to their perception of what I'm talking about today. So Susan Heathfield says succession planning is ensuring a nonprofit organization will never have an open position for which another employee is not prepared. She continues that succession planning is a systematic process for ensuring that employees are recruited and developed to fill each key role in a nonprofit organization before it becomes vacant. So it's going to be really important, as I continue through these 9 strategies, to really separate succession planning from employee retention strategies. Succession planning has to back up to employee retention. Employee retention has to back up to organizational culture. So you're going to hear some things that are more culture related versus retention related versus actually writing a succession plan as we go. So just know that we're kind of oscillating between those 3 connected areas. So strategy 1 comes to the board. It's the governance and the strategic planning component to what the board does. Governance and board leadership and strategic planning is absolutely critical to not only shaping, but maintaining a healthy culture. I need you to remember that culture always trumps strategy, and culture always starts with the board of directors. The board has to subscribe and be aware of board sources, board members' code of ethics. If your board's not following that code of ethics, you likely have a culture that is unhealthy, if not toxic. And recognize that your board is your cornerstone. Your board is your cornerstone, and just realize that from a masonry concept, the cornerstone is the first stone set that every other stone is lined up with, and the strength of the organization based on that cornerstone being used appropriately. So your board has to follow and subscribe and live on a day-to-day basis from a culture standpoint, the board source board members code of ethics. They have to recognize as the board leaders, they are the cornerstone of that organization. And as the cornerstone, they have to be mission and vision oriented. And they have to set a culture that's not based on the golden rule, that is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But we need a board to set a culture that expires the golden rule and evolves to the platinum rule, that board members should be treating others and staff and volunteers and clients and participants the way that the others would like to be treated. So many of you maybe have not heard the platinum rule. What it does is it goes from treating others the way that you want to be treated to you treating others the way that they would like to be treated. And that is absolutely critical to that underlying bun on that cheeseburger when we talk about cultural competence and diversity and equity and eliminating implicit bias in our organizations, as we have to evolve a culture that starts with the board, that lives by those board source board member code of ethics, and really creates a culture of the platinum rule to treat others the way that they would like to be treated. The reason I say that, and follow with me with my line of thought here, is that strategic nonprofit leadership for C-suite succession planning, it really starts with culture and good governance and then transcends into strategic planning. And so when I look at nonprofits, I'm a Midwestern guy that looks out my home office window and sees lots of cornfields, and I see these 125-year-old oak trees that still stand, and people say, wow, how does that oak tree stand in the middle of that wheat or cornfield through the storms that we've had since March? And it really comes down to the root system, the white part there underground. That root system is absolutely critical. And that root system is your board. It's your cornerstone. It's your board of directors. And that root system really is the governance and leadership function. And so let me enlarge this triangle within this root system. This is what your board has to do. So to go back to the gentleman's questions, is it the board or is it the staff or the CEO or senior staff? It is both, but I hope I'm making the point that it definitely starts with the board of directors. They are the governors, the governance function, and they are ultimately the leaders of the organization that set that culture and plan and implement their strategic plan and create those strategic partnerships to get at objectives, outputs, and outcomes that are tied to the mission and vision. And so boards have to not only understand, but do strategic planning. And when I talk about strategic planning, I talk about the Association of Strategic Planning's mantra that strategic planning is nothing more than a systematic process that we think, plan, and act. And we need boards to ethically think, plan, and act using the platinum rule. So to think, plan, and act, nonprofits, we really have what I use as a 6-phase strategic planning process. Phase 1 is where we really get prepared, or we do the think part of think, plan, act, where we're gathering organizational background information to prepare for phases 2 through 6. We identify our stakeholders, we clarify any formal or informal mandates placed on the organization, and initiate and agree our strategic planning process. In step 2, the board really needs to work through, with guidance from the CEO, of course, and the C-suite leadership, is phase 2. We need to not only identify the stakeholders in step 1 or phase 1, but we need to analyze stakeholders in phase 2. We do need to assess the needs of our clients, our target audience, and we need to audit organizational processes. So interesting thing here is when we analyze stakeholders, I use a power versus interest grid, and then I caveat that, or I extend that into fundraising planning, taking those with the highest level power and the highest level interest and putting them in the center of the constituency model for fundraising. We assess the needs of our target population through secondary data analysis, and then if not all of our questions are answered, we move into primary data analysis, and then we audit our organizational processes. And that means auditing your communications, marketing, and public relations function, your volunteer management function, your fundraising function, also your programs and services, and your financial management and audit. So when I'm talking about in the strategic planning phase 2 of auditing the organization, I'm talking about systematically auditing each one of these ingredients in the cheeseburger. So as we get into auditing our governance function, what we find is we audit the quality of the articles of incorporation and bylaws, and typically the founders of organizations do very little to create the appropriate culture within a 1 or 2 dimensional document. And you really have to think about your articles of incorporation and your bylaws as the breath of life in your organization. And starting and maintaining, establishing, maintaining a healthy culture starts with the articles of incorporation and bylaws within the governance function. And that's a piece that so many folks leave out, is they create a new nonprofit because they want to own their own nonprofit, and they haven't really done an environmental scan of what's out there and what's needed. But typically, founders will download template bylaws and articles of incorporation off the internet, and they're legal and they work to satisfy the Secretary of State's office at the state that they're incorporating. But really, their bylaws are extremely limited and do little or nothing for establishing and maintaining a healthy culture. Absolutely critical with the board to do these things, and to back succession planning up to employee retention, all the way back to culture, all the way to looking at your governing documents to really establish the culture that's going to create an organization that people want to stay and that people want to come to fill roles when they're open. So the next piece of phase 2 that you see here in purple is something that almost I've rarely ever seen, unless it's been part of a project I've worked in, is not only do we audit the organizational processes with finance and program evaluation and volunteer engagement, but we got to audit our organizational culture. And there are ways to actually assess organizational culture out there in reliable and valid ways, so that taking stock in where your culture is at and whether it's toxic or healthy or somewhere in between, that you can actually do that as a part of your continual strategic planning process. So I have nothing to do with this company. I'm not endorsing them. I'm simply using it as an example. I have no relationship or kickbacks or anything with this organization. But what my research has shown is that Human Synergistics International has the leading organizational culture inventory that's reliable and valid, that allows you to appropriately assess the culture of your nonprofit organization within the strategic planning process. And that's a new angle that I think a lot of you might be scratching your head and thinking about how strategic planning has happened in your organizations in your career, and that you've really never taken account of how important culture is, and that culture always trumps strategy. Think about that. Culture trumps strategy. Strategy is your strategic plan, but you're not thinking about your culture. So with that, you need to be able to articulate organizational culture as a part of the CEO and senior staff recruitment, selection, and onboarding processes. It's amazing to me the number of people that are looking for high-level employees, and in the interview process being a two-way street. If that potential employee says, so describe your organizational culture. How do things work around here on a day-to-day basis? How do people behave? How's conflict resolved? It's often that there's not an answer by those looking to hire that person. And in HR, and especially in universities, we often hear, oh, that candidate's not a good fit. Or you might hear about the proverbial fit and human resource decisions within your own organization. And when individuals sit on search committees and say, oh, are they a fit? They're really talking about, is that individual's personality and work style a fit with culture, meaning the unwritten rules and the way business is done on a day-to-day basis in and among the employees and volunteers and board within an organization. And that can be tough to measure. And if you're going to select employees to fit, you better be able to articulate what that culture is, or it's going to be very difficult to select the right employee that will have the fit with the organizational culture. So focusing on developing a healthy culture allows nonprofits to grow their own heirs apparent to the CEO and C-suite. So I really want you to focus in on this particular slide and really understand that when you focus on developing a healthy culture, it's going to allow you to grow your heirs apparent. I'm a wrestler, an old wrestler, and we used to look up to Dan Gable over at Iowa and Iowa State, and they used to have painted on their wrestling room wall that they don't rebuild, they reload. They were perennial Big 10 and Big 12 and NCAA champions that produced tons of Olympic wrestlers, and their attitude was, if they graduate a whole team of seniors, their incoming freshmen the following year are expected to compete for a national championship. And that's what I need you to take that Dan Gable approach to a wrestling team and really think about, how can you contribute to a healthy culture that uses the platinum rule to treat others the way they wanted to be treated, respecting diversity and equity and recognizing and mitigating implicit bias so that there's a culture of respect where people want to stay. And when people do move on for whatever reason, that there's somebody that's step in that role that's prepared to hit the ground running, that we reload, not rebuild your organization. So with that, succession planning is about retention, and employee retention is ultimately about culture. You need to act like you want people to stay. I've worked at places in my career where I just would go home and talk to my wife and I'm saying, I'm just not sure they want any of us to stay. And what's it feel like when people come to work? Do they want to come to work on a Monday morning and say, thank God it's Monday, it's 5 o'clock, it's cold and icy, it's dark, I got to scrape the ice off my car to work 80 hours for 20 hours pay for a mission I'm passionate about, and they're happy doing that? Is your board and is your senior staff setting a culture and a workplace environment that makes people feel like you actually want them to stay and to retain those employees? So with that, I hope I've answered the gentleman's question. I'd be glad to pause, Mac, and take additional clarifications or questions before I move into the second of our 9 strategies for succession planning.
I think you've got their attention right now. There's no new questions.
Okay. Are we doing okay on pace and time from your perspective, Mac?
We are. We have a couple people who said that you can slow down a bit. They're having trouble taking notes.
Okay, good.
So.
Sounds good. All right. Well, if there are no questions, I'll slow down a bit. Let's get into strategy 2, and that is how to hone in on that ingredient of the cheeseburger related to human resources. So think of the cheeseburger. Think of all the ingredients. The ingredients in the cheeseburger are the functions of a nonprofit organization, and one of those ingredients or one of those functions is human resources. And it's pretty common to have human resources addressed in a strategic plan, but they're usually not addressed all that well, particularly related to succession planning and human resources. So it's looking at your strategic plan. If you're sitting in your office with multiple screens open right now, get out your strategic plan and see if human resources is addressed in your strategic plan as a strategic priority, and see if there's anything in there related to succession planning or culture or employee retention. And I'm guessing for most of you, at least one or more of those things is completely omitted for whatever reason. And it's something that we have to do if we're serious about our mission. Human resources is what gets to the outcomes. If we don't have human resources of people that want to be there, that feel like you want them to be there, that are coming to work with the passion that they have to do the job to get your clients to your mission, that's a problem. And nonprofits only exist for the mission and vision of that particular organization to meet a documented need. There are people out there that have needs. Your organization was formed to meet that need. You have a mission and vision to meet that need. And if your people, your human resources, aren't getting the job done because of a culture issue or a retention issue or a succession planning issue, there's really no reason to have your doors open. And so we really have to think about, how do we seriously address human resources in the strategic planning function that the board leads and the staff implements. So with introducing strategy 2, think about this. Strategic nonprofit leadership for CEO and senior staff succession planning. As I said before, it starts with culture and good governance, led by the board. That transcends into the board and the senior staff doing the strategic planning. And it continues into strategic human resource management. So just chew on that bit for a bit, because the dominoes have to fall in order. You got to line up the dominoes in order. And so if we're going to line up succession planning, we have to knock down culture, which knocks down good governance, which knocks down strategic planning, which knocks down strategic human resource management. So here's a really interesting point, at least I find interesting, is that if your organization has no strategic plan, how can you possibly be strategic about employee recruitment and retention? It's silly to have a succession plan if you don't have a strategic plan. You have to have a left hand and a right hand. Those things have to work together like yin and yang. If you're only going to have one, I hope you have a strategic plan. I hope if you only have one, it's not the succession plan. So if you're sitting there thinking, well, we don't have a succession plan, Doc, and then you go, oh, we don't have a strategic plan either, I would say let's get the strategic plan done first after we assess culture, and then worry about building a succession plan, because the succession plan is how you're going to recruit and retain human resources to activate your strategic plan. And how can you possibly recruit the right person with the right skills to a C-suite level position if you don't know what you're recruiting for? If you're aimlessly driving in the dark through a train tunnel, how would you possibly know how to find the right next employee for a C-suite level position when you don't know what you're hiring them to achieve? So think about the strategic plan as what the human resources achieve. The succession plan is to get the people. So you got it. Good organizations have both. And if that's something missing, that's something that you can add to your to-do list. I'm sure the many things that you continue to add to your list day to day at your organization. So let's take a look at that cheeseburger again, as some of you are eating at your desk here. But we really have to think about, what does the human resource ingredient or function in the C-suite leadership look like within a strategic plan? This is my healthy oak tree, or my healthy nonprofit. And as you know, healthy oak trees have a strong root system, and that root system in a nonprofit is the board and their ability to do strategic planning and their ability to create strategic partnerships that all move towards outputs, outcomes, and objectives that are tied to their mission and vision. What I've shared before is none of that happens without mission-focused human resources. And so you can see my glue bottle here on the tree. That represents mission-focused human resources. And I'll come back to that in a reason here in just a second. The next phase of strategic planning is phase 3, which is where we collect data and gather input. We're still thinking for the Think Plan Act, and that's where we do things like focus groups and stakeholder meetings and identify strategic issues through SWOT analyses or TOES analysis. We do nominal group processes or oval mapping. And we jump into phase 4, where we agree on strategic priorities. And in phase 4 and phase 5 of strategic planning, this is where we really assemble our strategic plan. And in your strategic plan, you have to address human resources. You have to have a section in your strategic plan called human resources, where you identify SMART objectives, SMART being specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, that have a timetable. Have SMART objectives, that's your to-do list. You need to identify strategic outputs, like a % of retention of C-suite level employees, and then identify short-term outcomes. There should be a section dedicated in your strategic plan for human resources related to SMART objectives, strategic outputs, and short-term outcomes. As you get into that strategic planning process, this is what we consider the C-suite, and the C-suite needs to be accounted for in the human resources section of your strategic plan. We have to have the CEO, the Chief Operating Officer, the Chief Financial Officer, Chief Human Resources Officer, the CIO, the Chief Marketing Officer, and the Chief Strategy Officer. Other things related to human resources, as silly as it may sound, is actually have position descriptions and keep them up to date, and actually have a personnel evaluation and performance assessment process, and then actually evaluate employees on a regular basis and assess their performance. Strategy 3 is to have effective board leadership. And so this comes back to the concept of the cornerstone of the organization, or the roots in the tree, is that the board chair must set the tone and drive the board executive relationship. The board executive relationship significantly impacts culture. And so the culture starts with the board and starts with the board chair and the board chair's relationship with the CEO. The board's got to make succession planning a priority in the strategic plan. And that's something that our boards aren't doing. We've doubled the number of nonprofits in 20 years, less than 20 years. We went from 1 million to 2 million. That means the competition for qualified, capable, dedicated board members that have affinity and capacity and are competent to be a nonprofit board member, the competition for good board members is really, really strong. And so having a board that gets it, that can lead a nonprofit, it's hard to find those people. So recruiting good board members, onboarding them, and getting them to understand from a managing up perspective is that the board has to make succession planning of employees a major priority in the human resources section of the strategic plan. It's just critical. Board leadership is so critical to CEO succession planning and to the CEO transition. Besides the CEO, strategy 4 is that nonprofits need to invest in talent management. And so, as I've said before, things start with culture and governance, transcend into strategic planning. We integrate human resources into the strategic plan. And then within the human resources section, we have to talk about talent management. So if you really think about this, addressing human resources in the strategic plan is talent management and it's succession planning. Talent management is actually doing what you want to do, which is to act like you want people to stay. Well, how do you act like you want people to stay? You do talent management, and you put an emphasis and you put resources on talent management. This is the employee life cycle. It's a 7-step process, and you can see halfway through on the bottom left of your screen, as you can see that talent management is an absolutely critical part of keeping people from separating or offboarding from your organization. And so if you're going to extend the employee life cycle to retain employees so that they're actually trained employees ready to slide into higher level spots when they open, then we have to extend that employee life cycle. It's very tough to do succession planning when you have high turnover of your middle level managers. And so you have to find a way to keep them, and talent management is a critical part of that employee retention process. So talent management is going to help you activate that strategic plan related to human resources. Talent management is succession planning. Talent management is recruiting superior employees, and it's also developing knowledge, skills, and abilities in the staff that you have. It's a tool for CEOs and senior staff should they focus on identifying and seriously developing future candidates by the age of 30. So what the Harvard Business Review has found in their research is that if you're going to really target somebody to be on the CEO track and you're going to develop their talent and you're going to try to retain that employee across their career, that you really need to be identifying potential candidates for the CEO position as late as the age of 30, so that you have maybe most of their 30s and even some of their 40s to develop their talent to prepare them for the succession to the CEO role. Talent management is really preparing employees for advancement or promotion into ever more challenging roles in your nonprofit and scaling up their skills and making sure they have the skill set to take on the next challenge within your organization. So it's really about cross-training employees to handle mission-critical tasks when there's an abrupt personnel change. We're going to jump ahead to this point, is that if done well, succession planning can lead to the convergence of the organization's needs and the employee's wants and the employee's household needs. So some things that you can do to create opportunities for success and failure with your employees is to intentionally move your employees laterally for cross-training, assign them special projects to develop their skills, appoint them to leadership roles, and to provide internal and external professional development opportunities. And as you do that, in terms of talent management, is remember that succession planning is about retention, and it's ultimately about culture. And if done well, talent management can contribute to retention and a healthy culture. I think we're coming to an end here. I've got a few more slides to share, and then we'll be taking some questions, and then I'll hang on for the remainder until all the questions are asked. And if you need to jump off, you can at 1 o'clock, and I'll hang around for questions after that. Our next strategy is to simply assign responsibility for CEO and senior staff succession planning. That should be done in the strategic plan, but if it's not, somebody has to have that task put on their task list for their position description. Strategy 6 is to simply write and adopt a succession plan, which I'll address in the 3rd installment of my 3-article series during the month of August, so please look for that in your inbox. Strategy 7 is to limit the role of outgoing CEOs or senior staffs in the succession. There are definitely some do's and some don'ts that you'll see in the slide deck, like don't ask the outgoing CEO to be a member of the search committee. Don't allow the recently departed CEO to meet with staff regarding current issues and problems. But you should ask the outgoing CEO to pay close attention to changes in employee group dynamics. And you should ask the outgoing CEO to provide the new CEO with a list of key stakeholder names. Strategy 8 is that we have to value and reward strategic living. That's one thing we're driven to at Driven Strategic LLC is strategic living, which we talk a lot about in this leaderosity course. And what I found is the CEOs and HR managers and high-level C-suite individuals that take this course, I have a section on them talking about what I call their bandwidth barometer. What is their bandwidth and what is their barometer related to work-life balance? Are they in bed less than 8 hours most nights? Are they getting less than 60 minutes of physical activity less than 4 days each week? Are they chronically unhappy and stressed out? And do they always feel like they're treading water with their nose barely above water while they're drinking from a fire hose? And what we find is that most of our students in the Leaderosity course, upwards of 85 to 90%, say that their bandwidth barometer has run out in all of those key areas, and they are the unhappy burnout toast because their metaphoric workload or their plate is not only overflowing, but unhealthy and overflowing when their plate needs to look like this. We need to use a strategy to retain employees to get them to understand that we need to go deep as opposed to wide. Going deep, doing more with less. Busy doesn't mean impactful, and we need to have a culture that allows employees to say no to new tasks or to negotiate having something taken off of their plate before something's added. Okay, and managing our employees' bandwidth so that we actually retain our employees so that they're still there when we need to slide them into a higher level position with the succession plan. Busy for busy's sake and not allowing no is an unhealthy culture. And remember, people depart, C-suite leaders, CEO and senior staff depart because of toxic organizational culture, work-life balance issues that are unhealthy, physical and emotional health issues, burnout, and even sudden death. So you really got to remember, it can be real difficult to separate succession planning from retention strategies. And we really need to think about our final strategies to embrace volunteer engagement. And looking at volunteer engagement as one of our ingredients of our nonprofit is volunteers are also mission-focused human resources. And we tend to engage volunteers on the board and doing administrative and custodial work and maybe helping with programs. But rarely do I ever see nonprofits looking for pro bono, highly skilled volunteers to do work that our full-time salaried staff and even our C-suite leadership does. Why not have a highly skilled pro bono volunteer assist the chief marketing officer or serve as an assistant public information officer or be an HR assistant? Maybe a retired HR director from the for-profit sector could be a volunteer human resources assistant to assist the CHRO. It also amazes me the number of volunteer managers who don't use volunteers to help them run their volunteer program. And it always amazes me how low on the totem pole and organizational chart we put our full-time volunteer managers down at the coordinator level instead of at the CVO level. And to really think about adding a chief volunteer officer at the C-suite level to recognize how important it is to engage volunteers at a high level to lighten our full-time staff's load so that they have a healthier bandwidth barometer. So you really just need to reimagine how your organization can engage volunteers to build capacity and to reimagine how your organization can engage volunteers to build capacity at the C-suite level. So really thinking about how your organization can engage volunteers to limit CEO and senior staff turnover and reimagine volunteer work design. So with that, we're coming to an end. I've given you 9 strategies, albeit fast, but don't worry, you got the slide deck, you got the 3-article series coming to your inbox, and you have the recorded session, so you should be able to review these. You can also make an appointment with me and talk about issues within your organization. Yes. And so,
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So we have our 9 strategies. We've talked about governance and strategic planning for human resources, board leadership, talent management, responsibility assignment, as well as writing and adopting a succession plan, limiting the role of outgoing senior staff, rewarding strategic living, not penalizing it, and embracing volunteer engagement. So with that, culture does trump strategy. Strategy drives structure. Structure requires resources. Resources accomplish objectives, produce outputs, and achieve outcomes. Outcomes effectuate mission, and mission begets vision. Culture always trumps strategy. Culture is a human resource issue at all levels, including the C-suite. And attracting and retaining top talent is one of the greatest culture challenges that we have in the nonprofit sector. With that, I'd like to thank the 501c Agencies Trust and 501c Services, and I'd be glad to make myself available for the rest of the afternoon. And if you need to follow up by email or make an appointment on my time trade, just go to my website, and I'd be glad to help your organization or digest some of the information that I presented today. Thank you.
All righty. Thank you, sir. You want to take a couple of questions while we got 5 minutes?
I'm here, and I can stay on for a few hours if there's that. Okay. And I'm sure there's not that many questions, but I will take questions, and I understand others got to jump off for their next appointment.
Excellent. So Dean wants to know if you have any tools that you'd like to recommend regarding recruiting a successful board.
Tools for recruiting a board? I think that's probably something I'd probably need to hear Dean's situation with his board. The very first thing is to actually put a board recruitment process together and not recruit your board all willy-nilly. It amazes me the number of organizations that have no systematic process. They're not doing a strategic needs table or a recruit attribute chart, or even inventorying the current skills of their current board members. And they're also looking at bylaws. Looking at your bylaws and seeing how board member recruitment and terms and how all of the governance structure of your board is actually set up in your bylaws is a great starting point. So I'd be glad for a follow-up question from Dean there. But there's some pretty simple things to start with, is to look at the process, setting expectations, having board member position descriptions that outline expectations, roles and responsibilities, board giving policy, attendance policy, having a board member evaluation. And even though they're volunteers and on the board, they need to be evaluated and they need to be moved on from that. Having a natural minor league, think of the St. Louis Cardinals and the minor leagues that Branch Rickey set up. We need to have volunteer opportunities. We need to scale a volunteer's participation to committee, special projects, to an advisory board, and then perhaps as they show a commitment and an understanding of the mission and the organization and build that institutional history, then they move up to a board member position. Many nonprofits just, their board recruitment's a pulse and a breath. They put 2 fingers on the neck and a mirror under the nose, and if there's a pulse in the neck and a breath on the mirror, they say, hey, you want to be on the board, and that's just not the way to do it. So hopefully I've given some reasonable strategies that good nonprofits use to better recruit and to load their board with people that are going to set a culture that leads to employee retention and good succession planning strategies.
So what are your some quick thoughts about an organization where, like, their mission is maybe child development, and the chief operating officer has child development background, but the CEO is really doing fundraising and development and stuff like that. Do you have any thoughts about how organization tackles that type of dynamic? I mean, should they try to find perhaps someone with that child development background who could be a CEO? What kind of advice do you have along those lines?
Oh, I think it depends. I think to be a CEO, it depends how big the organization is, and it depends ultimately who's the person in the trenches designing and engineering the experiences that the kids are going through. That skill set to engineer experiences that actually get kids to developmental outcomes, that's a really tough skill set, which is very different than the CEO skill set. And I realize some nonprofits are small enough that maybe the CEO is the CEO doing CEO stuff like finance and auditing and dealing with the board, and they might also be the one doing the logic modeling and the program design and actually on site at the after school program. So depending on the situation, it may be the same person or it may be a different person. The CEO skill set to do a traditional CEO job and the skill set to be a program director for an outcome-based youth development program that actually measurably gets kids to the mission and the short-term outcomes of the logic model, 2 very different skill sets, and you have to have a pretty seasoned person that can juggle life to do both of those roles in a single organization. And there are people that do that, but they're a really unique breed to find. So I'm not sure I've entirely answered the question other than trying to understand how big the organization is, what their annual budget is, their gross receipts, what their expenses are, and how much can they afford. If they can afford 2 different people or even 3 different people to split those tasks, then they can recruit staff to make sure their staff actually has the skills for the job that they're being hired to do. we make an assumption if we keep kids safe and make sure they're having a darn tootin' good time, that somehow they're magically having Christian principles put into practice at the YMCA after school program. What I know from my youth development research, it's just not the case. You know, what is when we put caring adults and close association of kids over a period of time using primarily relationships and mentoring through youth sports, camps, after school programs, tutoring, STEM, whatever it might be. It's not the program, it's the relationship of the adult mentor, the staff member, the volunteer. And that's a tough skill set, and that's typically not the same skill set as a CEO.
Gotcha. Now let's just tackle one more here.
Okay.
Emergency succession planning. Do you have any thoughts on that? Like who should perhaps lead that process? A board team, maybe a member of the C-suite?
Yeah, I mean, if you're smart enough to have an emergency succession plan, you should have a succession plan, right? You shouldn't get yourself in a position where you have to have an emergency plan. But if you're an organization that doesn't have a written succession plan and hasn't had that conversation, and it's a board that hasn't put priority on that in the strategic planning process to include succession planning, what I would really recommend is it should be, and some nonprofits, they still use the executive committee for that. Others, I think we're seeing an evolution. The executive committee is going away and the nominating committee is going away, and those two things are being combined with some additional responsibilities to what we call a governance committee. And oftentimes the governance committee would handle emergency succession planning. Perhaps the board chair might become also the interim CEO, or there might be a personnel committee that can triage that particular issue in that nonprofit organization.
Okay. Well, everybody sees Nathan's information there. If you have any other questions, you can also email me and I can shoot them to him. Nate, thanks for your time today.
Thank you. Does anybody want to hang around past 1 to ask any questions live or have a conversation? I'm glad to hang on if anybody needs anything.
Doesn't look like it. I think we're
okay,
good.
Great. Well, thanks for listening today. I know it's a lot of information, but hopefully the extra resources, the online articles, and the recorded YouTube video will help you digest that information and chew on some of that and make a to-do list for your organization.
All right. Perfect. Thank you, sir. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, Mac. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye.